so that was kind of my one. I got to,
So it's in that back room, and there's maybe like 100 people there, 200 people.
Yeah, it's not. Well, you're calling it a back room, but you would go to the back, then you go upstairs, and the stage, the back of the stage was the windows out on Houston Street.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they were actually facing inward.
Yeah, but,
gotcha. Yeah, so that was, and then they ended up, the album came out on Blast's first record. It didn't come out on SST, and it was a big, it was the big double record. It was kind of their big breakthrough. I don't know if they had already gotten they were turning down Geffen yet at that point, because remember that was a big deal that I asked Greg about too, about Husker Du going to Warner Brothers, and he's like yeah, well, we thought it was a little early. Like that first Candy Apple Grey was supposed to be our album, or was it Candy Apple Grey or New Day Rising? Well, New Day Rising.
Yeah.
And Candy Apple Grey was the first Warner one, right before Warehouse Songs, right? And so he's like that was going to be an SST record, and we were obviously disappointed, but he's like, those guys thought Land Speed record was a pop record. Like they thought, like, from day one they should be on a major label. Like they
So the crux of that book, like the Michael Azerrud book, it's like he just when the guys come out and say, like, the thing was, we were getting burned by all these guys, and there was supposed to be some sort of like indie allegiance, to each other and stuff like that. And, money didn't really matter, except for, like, if we were making some money, then it should be, equal. Whatever the deal was, that was all fine. And then they were like, but we were getting burned anyway. And they just, so we figured we'll just take the money, and it was like,
but the records got so. I mean, it's never that simple, right? So the first hand, the indies were getting screwed all the time, right? The SST survived because they never played into I just have one distributor. Right, they would actually have a bunch of indie distributors. So if one went belly up or wasn't paying them, it didn't cut them off. But they learned that the hard way too. There was, in fact, I don't know if you remember a band called Angst.
Sure.
So they were from San Francisco, and they were actually two brothers that had worked at one of their distributors up in San Francisco, who eventually went bankrupt too. And so these, I remember the big thing that totally devastated indie records and the indie labels in the late 80s was Rough Trade was signing up and writing checks to get exclusive distribution of all these indie labels in the late 80s. They started picking up all these different, and then they went bankrupt. And so all these indie labels, even though if you sold a lot of records, you weren't going to get paid for them. They were gone. They went back, and that took out a lot of records, including Rough Trade, which was like a friggin' powerhouse. Like they had, they had the Pixies and stuff like that.
So John, I just want to tell the kind of a little bit to our listeners who may not have grown up or been into this music. All these bands we're talking about were they could not get record deals and couldn't get this major distribution. So this now becomes a string of
early 80s. This is punk, right? So just to right. So the original round of punk rock, people talk about indie cred, but all punk rock in the late 70s came out on major labels. It mostly, that was the only way to get a record. There were no indie labels. The closest you got was maybe an IRS Records, but IRS was distributed by MCA or Island Records, depending on what years. Right?
I always thought of Rough Trade as kind of a punky label when I was a kid, though. Like when I was a kid and you're first looking to try to get a Clash record and all that stuff, when you saw Rough Trade, you immediately thought this was something I'm interested in, even if you didn't know who
you're mixing. So that's why I'm just trying to put some
tell us the backstory here, John.
Chronology here.
Yeah,
the Rough Trade is not. You've never heard of Rough Trade unless you're buying imports. At the time I'm talking about, the 70s, Rough Trade was literally like this guy put out Warm Leatherette as a 12-inch record, later covered, probably more famous for us now, by Grace Jones, and it was just this kind of weird indie dance record, and it became like the beginning of Rough Trade. Rough Trade was kind of out of a store, it was more of a retailer. So Rough Trade just started putting out records. So eventually Rough Trade is start signing bands like the Smiths, and they're really, they are, like you said, like this is like, I want to say 80, 81 is when we're starting to see them as getting, their bands are getting signed. So Rough Trade is getting picked up, their bands are getting signed, and the Rough Trade logo is on the Sire Records release.
Right, and maybe that's where I'm picking it up from, like a Ramones record or something like that. Exactly. You know what I mean? Like
that's the thing. So these are technically that label is an indie overseas, but in the United States it is distributed by Warner Bros. Depeche Mode is on Mute Records, an independent label, but it is signed to Mute in the United States. In fact, it's actually signed through Quincy Jones in the United States through Quest Records, which was Quincy Jones. So they're all to get around the big, huge United States, they need this means of distribution. So once again, you have little labels in like SST finding different means to get records into stores. There's this new network that's built from selling things in the back of fanzines and having to get them stocked in these cool record stores from the late 70s and early in the 80s indie record store that we know, ended up being these local distributors would start picking up their local labels and finding national outlets, finding all of these little stores to put them in. So the indie distributor really grew in the 80s, right? And so once again, so Tony, it was definitely, the mother of invention was this necessity of it wasn't like my hardcore records were going to get Warner Distribution wasn't going to pick it up. Warner Electro Atlantic wasn't going to pick it up. Columbia Sony Distribution wasn't going to pick, you know what I mean? So they became this alternative network of picking up records, but they also succumbed to record stores. Like it's like everyone always had cash flow issues. So it would be like you, Chris, you've heard me joke about this before. It's like, is that you, okay, a hit could kill a record label, because all of a sudden, if you have imagine something like the Beastie Boys putting out Cookie Puss, right? Now, all of a sudden, I get this souped up demand. And so it's like, shit, people want this record. I'm going to print 100,000 of them. It's going to cost me $1 a copy. I have to get $100,000. I'm going to buy, so I put $100,000 into the system. But how long before it gets to a record store, becomes cash, comes back to me? But that distributor is already bought more records with that money, and so they have to pay for the previous hit first before they pay for your hit. So you need a second hit to make you be the person that now gets priority to get money. So that's where SST was really valuable, in that it brought together a lot, like New Alliance Records and all that. It became a place. It's like, well, they didn't really get into the black until they had literally double nickels and Zen Arcade. Yeah. Like the guy who was the head of sales at the time it was like, the joke was, he was telling me, he's like, the record stores were calling us because they were doing their own distribution too. And he's like, and I would just put them on hold for a half hour. Fuck those guys, and he'd be like, he's like, you want my record? And so there was finally this demand, and it was like, you got to pay me cash for these, and it was like, and that was that if you think about, that's 82. I'm trying to remember, 82 or 84, and the first Black Flag record is like 79. So they're starving the first couple of years, even though they're making money by selling T-shirts and records at the shows because they're getting the cash in hand. So that's the thing. Then someone swoops in, and this will be the story till the end of time. Is like, oh, this punk rock thing. Oh, no, we can't touch it. It's scary. Oh, my gosh, it's making money. And that's where I got swept into the major labels.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden it became like, wow, you got cred because you were at SST. And so I got a gig at MCA Records.
You're the enemy, as Greg said.
No. So then,
MCA. Yeah. You're never going to live that one.
I'm never going to live that. But the music center.
Leonard Skinner and Black Flag don't play together.
But then all the people I ended up in Atlantic with, it were like, oh, so and so was friends with Courtney Love, and and it's like, hey, Melvin's come over and signed to Atlantic. It's like remember there's that whole flood of like,
Yeah, but John, let me back you up a second. When you were at SST, or when SST was at this height, how many employees are we talking about there? Like 10? Or were there like 50 to 100?
I was probably as part of the staff at its biggest, and I want to say there was. I won't count the warehouse people because that was actually a big. That you remember that SST catalog? That was a big go. But I want to say there might have been 3 or 4 people in the warehouse. But so there's 3, 4, 5, maybe 8 or 10.
Is one of those 10 people an accountant of some kind?
But in the most punk rock way.
Right, he's just some guy that's good with the calculator.
Nig Heist?
Sure. Yep.
Right. One of them. So Mugger was the accountant.
But he's like some sort of math wizard anyway, so
So he goes off and he gets an account, but he was the guy who was telling all the guys at Sam Goody's to go fuck themselves.
Right. But what I'm getting at is it's more than just being good at numbers, because you don't want a guy who's an aerospace engineer who's good at math. You need like a street level guy, like these guys that come out in the 60s.
Morty.
That's what I mean. Right? And, it's a cash business. There's all this money that's floating around, all these these low level mobster kind of people in this industry, and everybody's, and it's like you need a street smart guy that's good with numbers.
Yeah, but this is not Morris Levy gangster days anymore.
I know, but it's the same. I guarantee you, it's like the same kind of it's a different decade, but it's the same mentality of people back there.
Think about when Bo Blaze came to see us, Tony.
Yeah, that's
the guy
he was a guy like that.
Dog voices or whatever. And he just saw these crazy punk rock kids. Maybe I can make a good little coin on this, but he was never invested in the music at all.
He saw an opportunity. This is big. Yeah. This kind of music is big right now, and you're telling me there's an unsigned band playing that kind of music. That it's the early '90s. We were right there playing that kind of music. But I'm talking about in the '80s. It's the same kind of thing that happened with hip hop, where nobody knew about.
You're fantasizing a little, Tony. I mean, it's
okay.
And John went over to work for Rowdy Records too, so he'll tell you about hip hop music in New York City. The 1990s,
80s.
Atlanta,
late 80s, maybe even, right?
Atlanta, late 90s.
Okay.
I am. Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Finish your thought, John. You were talking about.
I don't know what my thought was, but I was saying, as far as so Mugger, the guy who played completely naked in Nig Heist, was essentially the guy who got the accounting degree and managing all the accounting and did a great job.
But I guess I'm sorry to cut you off, but John, what I envision, and it's like this is a narrative that has happened over and over again.
Yeah.
It's a couple of guys that start out to do something out of necessity, and they hit on something because it can parallel like the personal computing.
The story of Atlantic Records is the story of, it's probably more the story of Sub Pop Records, because SST essentially went down before they fought it in the same way. I mean, Discord essentially fought it too, but Discord keeps it going. They stayed. That
story sounds familiar. I've heard it a lot of times, and it's
Erdogan, who's a well-to-do guy, in Washington D.C. going to prep schools, but loves
jazz,
R&B music and jazz, and worships his brother, who's a big jazz.
By the way, Dukowski plays in Nig Heist too, right? Is that Mugger and Dukowski? Who plays in that band? Or 2 roadies? What was the lineup?
Yeah. Mugger was a roadie.
Mugger was the guy I was talking about earlier. He was the guy pushing people off the stage at the Black Flag show.
What year would this be? 83, 82?
No, I'm talking 86, 87, something like that.
I think they're done in 87. I want to say 86.
No, I definitely saw Black Flag in 87. I was seeing them.
So Kira's playing bass and stuff at that
I saw
point.
Right, I saw that. Yep. I mean, I saw them prior to that, but I saw that. Yep.
Yeah, Kira and Watt were I don't know, either just ending or they were still together. They were still doing the Dose thing when I was there. But no, so Mugger, because this is what's when I get there when all of this goes off the road, right? So I don't know if they're still playing any, because remember, Christmas '86 is when D Boon, van crashes.
'85, I thought it was.
I get there in November '80s. Yeah, it could be '85. You're right. So when does Black Flag call it quits? Because all of this is sort of like they're like a lot of the longtime SST people are gone.
Wasn't there a point where you, like I felt it? Like I felt sorry for Black Flag at one point while they were still putting records out. The same way I felt bad for the Clash. Like it felt funny to me.